My name is John. I want to talk about this movement called Recent Revival and the idea of bringing people together across different political ideologies, tribes, movements, groups, and finding common ground and trying to escape this entrapment of people self-segregating into their ideological camps, and also trying to build a bridge and try to bridge the gap between the left and the right on key issues like peace and justice reform and human flourishing when it comes to the poor and stuff like that. There's ways we can bridge these gaps because people express themselves in different languages, people enshrine themselves in different symbols, but if we can understand the commonality and map out the common ground and understand the psychological barriers to having a conversation and the psychology of people on the left and the right in different ways, and also work across demographics and engage people better. When we do this, we can bridge a gap, a very needed gap on many issues. The role of money and corruption in our system is an area that should bridge both the left and the right, and we've seen this to a degree but with both Trump and Sanders. Another area is justice reform, mass incarceration, and more humane, cost-effective, scientific, better ways that operate within the community rather than top-down federal government telling everyone what to do. This should resonate with conservatives, and yet liberals intend to monopolize the conversation through left-wing activism about mass incarceration reform. But there are many conservatives working behind the scenes to do this, and yet the right has failed to make that a key issue. And as a result, they've failed to engage and build a bridge with many minority communities. And it's in their interest to do so, and it's in the interest of the left to build a dialogue and outreach with moderate conservatives and to try to bridge that gap and enlist more people to see why this is a problem. People that are not on the side of justice reform. The left should be having conversations with them rather than turning them away. And people on the right that want to work with them, they should be building this bridge. Both sides have an interest to do this. Now, with that said, let's talk about the idea of a nonpartisan peace movement. The most serious, well-articulated, loud, and well-organized peace movements tend to be, or the movements for peace tend to be confined to the more dogmatic corridors of the conversation, to the more ideologically rigid or politically fringe spheres of discourse. So this tends to isolate a lot of people that are not on the far left, that may not know these very kind of reclusive circles of political activism that often speak to their echo chambers and don't always build the bridges they need to. And many movements do this. I'm not saying all movements fail to do this, but the loudest movements for peace are often confined to very left-wing corners of the conversation. But I don't think it has to be a left or a right, confined to a extreme left or right issue. I think we can we mainstream a peace movement, talking about whether we're talking about bombing in Syria or corporate power in Latin America displacing some farmers off their land. If we can ground the conversation about the innate rights of the individual and the sanctity of individual rights in human beings and human dignity and the innate worth of people, if that is the starting point, as it should be for the left and the right, if you're a classic conservative tracing your values back to the Enlightenment, then the starting point, whether you're going off Judeo-Christian values or secular values, Enlightenment values, Jefferson, thinkers of the Age of Reason, whatever you're anchoring it off of, if you are a conservative, you claim to be a conservative, then the starting point should be the innate value and worth and dignity of the individual, not just for a poor farmer somewhere in Kansas, but for a farmer somewhere in Bolivia or someone being bombed in Syria. That is the only logical extension of that starting point. If we can anchor the conversation that way, then both liberals and conservatives should converge on the idea that corporate power, by that I mean money and influence and elite revolving doors between the elites and the government, that has influenced terrible atrocities and terrible human rights abuses in South America, for example, and in many other countries. And yet that tends to be confined to left-wing circles of activism because much of the right, the conservatives, have handed that conversation to the left. They have fundamentally failed to make that one of their issues. And this is a failure of conversation that is hurting everybody involved. It is in everyone's interest to get more people talking about this and humanize and close this empathy gap by allowing people in different parts of America to better humanize people abroad, and people within America to humanize America, for Americans to humanize Americans, for whites in the suburbs to humanize blacks in poor communities, and for people in communities to better humanize police officers instead of stereotyping them as all, being killers worthy of our disdain. Now, most people don't say that about police, but there's increasing sentiment within many justice movements that fundamentally, viscerally stereotypes police. At the same time, we have to address the issues of mistreatment of minorities by our police system, and there are some bad apples, and there are certainly structural problems within our system of both justice as well as within our policing, and especially in smaller cities and towns, that fundamentally has to be addressed. So you can be pro-cop and pro-black and say Black Lives, Blue Lives Matter. We all need to find ways to humanize each other and close the empathy gap. So if we can have a movement like this that speaks the language of different groups and is based on reason and compassion rather than left and right wing ideology, that doesn't have to revert or resort to ideologically divisive or dogmatic language, and can avoid the pitfalls of groupthink and this false binary of us versus them. If we can make it more inclusive, build dialogue across the spectrum, let's have a nonpartisan peace movement based on science and compassion. If we can do that, and we could talk about why it's wrong to displace a farmer in Bolivia, or why we should be more careful when we support bombing children in Syria, if we could find a way to have that conversation in a way that escapes the entrapment of left versus right, then we'll have a true basis for humanizing each other in this country, starting with our police and our communities. Thank you.